So, sightseeing, clothing stores, and so forth. Over on the right, you see the impact by category. Now, this is very important to understand because what we've noticed is in the lockdown, the people that have been impacted the most are down here: the food service, the sales, the production. Construction has actually come back, but it was hit hard right away. A tremendous amount of impact on low income and lesser skilled labor. Now, the reason I bring that up is because the decisions are being made by people up here. And in a socioeconomic environment, it's very interesting that there's a disconnect, because the people who are saying, stay home, don't go out of your room. Well, they're the folks that can work from home. They're the people who have the ability to be remote and still make the same wages they were before. It's the folks who starve and lose their house if they don't go to work that have been suffered and have been told stay home. So you got to understand it's more than just numbers. There's a socioeconomic impact and gap between the decision makers and the folks actually impacted. So you've heard about the V, the W, the Q, the K, I don't know, they give you every letter in the alphabet to describe the recovery potential. Well, here's a good example. So Indiana, of course, lockdowns occurred, massive layoffs, and we've seen this huge comeback. So as the state has begun to open the economy back up, we've seen a significant increase in the employment here in the state of Indiana. This is short term. Dr. Belcher will talk in a moment about the long term. Manufacturing, same impact. Huge drop, impressive recovery coming out of the removal of the lockdowns. And you all probably saw this last week, the GDP figure. We had the largest drop in GDP recorded in history. As Trump is a guy who's known for hyperbole, I would say the last 6 months have actually said, yeah, hyperbole may be the appropriate phrase here, because we had the largest drop in GDP and then we had the largest increase in GDP. So definitely reinforcing the whole concept of a V recovery here. And what I found pretty interesting as I pulled data on building permits, because building permits are a very good indicator of activity, because people have to get a permit before they can do construction. So they're very much looking to the future. And I'd say someone like Juan Paz in his industry is very much looking for, should we continue projects that were already on the books? And I think what you see here is that really the forecast was optimistic. You didn't see much of a change in the residential building permits. You can go back to the Great Recession of 2008, and you definitely see that. Here, there's no difference. So it looks as if a lot of the industry was forecasting a recovery and that the lockdowns would not have a long-term impact. We will talk about long-term impact in a minute, but we still want to focus on what's been happening to the economy. You can see corporate profits. The Great Recession, of course, hit it pretty hard. We've had a very successful corporate profit trend until the lockdowns again, and they've been hit. Now, of course, there are certain industries, Zoom, for example, has done pretty well. Online retailers, including Amazon. But then again, you've seen, Brooks Brothers, JCPenney, J. Crew, the laundry list goes on and about corporations that have gone under as a consequence. Some of them were teetering on the brink of disaster before this happened. But then, of course, once the lockdowns occurred, then it was game over. And Dr. Belcher will fill you in on a little bit what the game over for some companies has been.
So what you see here is some data that came from a survey that was done by Yelp. And what they were looking at based on data that they have about businesses was business closures. So this data reflects businesses that were open in March. So if you think about it, at least from our perspective at the university, March is kind of when, the decision was made around spring break to have the students not come back, and things really were locking down tight. Since that March 1st point, you can see what's happened in terms of the number of businesses that have closed. The thing that's really important to look at this, not just that upper line where it's the total number of businesses that are closed, it's the businesses that Yelp identified as permanent closures, okay? And that's that red line that you see down at the bottom. So there were businesses that were closed temporarily. We had some government support with PPP loans to try and keep people afloat. That was a temporary fix. And so what's happened is that a lot of businesses have permanently closed, and that's a significant impact from the lockdown. And the longer the lockdown went in certain places, I mean, it was not geographically distributed evenly, but the longer the lockdown was in place, there were just businesses that could not stay afloat. And so they went under. This is another slide from that data set that looks at where the businesses were closing the most. So these are business closures with the highest rate. You can see that a lot of those were states that had more restrictive lockdowns or longer lockdowns. There's also places there that, like Hawaii, for example, that are heavily dependent on tourism. So Hawaii, Nevada, places like that. But most of these states are states that had more restrictive lockdowns. And so I think that's important because, once again, the more significant the lockdown in terms of what they did, and the longer the lockdown, what we're seeing is that there are some businesses that just can't stay afloat after a certain point in time. This looks at the closures by sector, and this is interesting. And this goes back to one of the slides that Matt looked at before, that kind of socioeconomic divide slide, where he was talking about people that were able to work from home versus people that were sort of frontline, in your face kind of people, the checkout person at the grocery store or a server at a restaurant, where there was a lot of personal contact involved. So if you look at this split, what you see are people like lawyers and accountants that can perform their services remotely. They can talk to their clients like we're doing now, right? Through a Zoom call. They can do everything remotely. They can send everything electronically. Now, the interesting piece in this slide is you think, well, why are lawyers and accountants grouped with auto repair and landscaping? Well, you can have somebody cut your grass and take care of your shrubs and never have to look at them or never have to have contact with them. You can schedule online. You can watch them do it from inside your house. You can pay them online. So there were sectors like that, or businesses like that, that didn't necessarily have to have contact. You can drop your car off. Right side, on the other hand, food trucks, clothing stores, gift shops, breakfast and brunch, those are areas where you're going to have a lot of contact with somebody. And therefore, those kinds of businesses were hit harder than the ones on the left. Total closures here, if we look at this, once again, this is from the Yelp survey, you can see kind of what we're talking about. These are businesses that involve a lot of close interpersonal contact. Restaurant servers, retail, you're in a store, going to a beauty salon, for example, to get your hair cut, or a styling place to get your hair styled, bars, right? A lot of interpersonal contact, a lot of people packed into tight spaces. And so in a lockdown, those are the kinds of businesses that were hit the hardest, because those were businesses where there was probably a greater chance of transmission of the virus.
So one of the, if you may not have heard of this report before, if you have, I consider it the best real-time report in the market. It's the Purchasing Managers Index. They have a number of them. This is the production version, the manufacturing version of the report. It's the dominant report that's out there, and it's real time. And let me explain what it does. This line in the middle, the red line, the 50, that's kind of like, for those of you that are baseball buffs, we call that the Mendoza line. So if you're above 50, that means that your business is expanding, or in this case, the manufacturing base of the country. If it's below 50, that means you're contracting. It's better than the GDP number. It's industry based. It's not influenced by government deficits and fiscal policy. So it's directly real industry related. And you can see back in 2008-9, during the Great Recession, of course, we had quite a dip in this, and there was a contractionary result. Going into the lockdown, we see that again. And that's not the part I want to emphasize to you. What I want to emphasize is the uptick. This is, everyone keeps arguing about it, especially in the political season, what kind of recovery. It's a legitimate V recovery. I showed you earlier the unemployment data. I showed you, of course, I'll show you the GDP data coming up, or we showed you the GDP data as well. So you can see it's a pretty big expansion. But what I like about this report is the comparison. So what I have here is the comparison between October and January. And this is the pre-COVID data. Again, we were doing pretty good. We were above 50. We were in an expansionary mode. It tends to drop right after Christmas anyway, because people aren't buying as much. So, but it was still above 50. New orders, we were growing. Again, that means you were buying more than you were the previous month. But look at the comparison to this last month, October. We are expanding at a new order rate that we have not ever seen in this report. This is a very impressive new order. So this just indicates a very strong V recovery, and employment is expanding. So that's the good news for all those people that were laid off. We see an expansion of employment. Back in January, the reason that was below 50 is because we had a shortage of labor. You may recall that pre-COVID, the unemployment rate was 3.2%. That's actually more than full employment. We had a labor shortage. So it's not as if there wasn't a demand, because when you look at new orders and the PMI, they were above 50. We just didn't have the people. Now we have excess people relative to the workforce, so expansion is possible. Look at deliveries and inventory. So finally, inventories are growing again. So I guess that means we're gonna have more toilet paper on the shelf. You're able to get your clean wipes. So that's a good thing. So think of this second to the last line as just replace the word inventory with toilet paper. So everybody's fine. Andy's stocked up for 6 months, so nobody needs to go. He's covered. So everybody else, you can go out and buy your toilet paper. But also what I like is the backlog. This means that industry cannot fulfill the orders that they have on the books. So that's why we have the employment expansion. That's why we have new orders. The new orders are driving this. And so everything looks really good right now. Well, not everything, okay? As Dr. Belcher mentioned a moment ago, you've got those permanent closures. So while yes, the economy is coming back, it's not going to be fully back. And if you look at the unemployment data, we're still at 7.9 nationally and 6.2 in Indiana. And these numbers are underreported. I won't go into the nerdiness of it, but the BLS data, there's a thing called the U5 number, which is a more accurate number. So these numbers are really still over 10% if you look at the other ways that they calculate it. So we've got some ways to go. And there are, despite the good news, despite the great economic recovery that we're seeing right now, there are a lot of people being left behind. And this is important, there's some major long-term problems. And Dr. Belcher is going to talk about what some of those problems are.
So one of the things that demographers have been tracking for quite some time is the shift between urban and non-urban areas. So, a number of years ago, there was a lot of discussion that, there was this period of new urbanization. And what they meant by that was, young people in particular were flocking to urban areas. You had, technology centers like San Francisco. You have financial centers like Chicago and New York. And so you've got people that are flocking to the urban areas. And what they were saying was, well, that's kind of the model of the future. A lot of density, mass transit, those kinds of things. Suburbs, nah, who wants to live in the suburbs anymore? Well, that's shifted, okay? And I have a mid-20-something child who lives in Chicago and wanted to move to Chicago, lives in Chicago, and has been there for a couple of years, and he's seeing the downside of that. Well, others have seen the same thing, particularly millennials, as they begin to age and they begin to say marry or begin to think about families. Urban areas are not as conducive to that. And the COVID and the lockdowns have simply reinforced that. If you think about, the spread of the virus, urban areas are just basically magnets for that spread. Think of New York, apartment buildings or, houses stacked next to one another, people on top of one another, everybody using mass transit, right? A lot of crowds on the street. So, from a spread point of view, you've got conditions there that are more conducive to that. So one of these demographic shifts is away from those urban environments and into places that are more family friendly, that have lower density. One of the other things that tends to drive people out of urban areas is the exorbitant cost of housing, whether it's rental or ownership. The other things are more subtle, things like civic engagement, being able to be part of a community. They feel like that's better, they're better served to be in a less dense environment. This is particularly true with the millennials. So Joel Kotkin is a guy that's at Chapman University in California, one of the preeminent demographers in the country right now. And so he does a lot in terms of population shifts and those sorts of things. So what they're looking at are movement out of urban areas and into places, particularly with populations of less than 1 million. So Austin, Texas, Dallas, Nashville, Tennessee is seeing huge amounts of influx and growth. Indianapolis, movement into the suburbs, places where housing costs are more reasonable. Okay. You can get property and you have the opportunity to become more civically engaged. So after COVID, sort of reinforcing these things, a survey that was done by Harris, this is a Harris poll, 39% of people in urban areas discussed moving out of urban areas and relocating. So once again, the largest demographic group that they saw in the poll was 18 to 34-year-olds. Social distancing and remote work were big drivers of that. The fact that they could spread out, not be so tightly packed, and given the prevalence now, or the greater prevalence of remote work, it would simply be easier to do that. They didn't need an office anymore. And they also listed quality of life things, outdoor space, community engagement, those kinds of things. Another big change that's taken place has to do with supply chains. So if you think about, say, manufacturing, manufacturing is really a global enterprise. So companies in the US might have plants in China or in Vietnam or in Mexico or other places. They go there because potentially they have lower labor costs and other things like that. But when something like COVID hits, it shuts things down totally. So if your manufacturing is all in China and China shuts down, you're in trouble. You don't have a place to go. We saw this a number of years ago with a huge earthquake in Japan. Same thing, country shuts down. Automobile manufacturers in particular had their supply chains totally disrupted. So you've got companies now in the US that are starting to bring manufacturing back to the US for the following reasons. Made in the USA, I mean, you may think of it as a marketing slogan, but it works. Protection of intellectual property. Other countries are not as diligent, we'll say, about intellectual property as we are in the States. Shorter lead times. If you've got your manufacturing in the country, you can get orders in, as Matt's talking about, these increases in orders with the PMI. You can get them in quicker and get things out, get product out quicker. Quality control, you're not relying on a plant manager or somebody in China somewhere or in Vietnam to assess quality. What they found is with offshore manufacturing, a lot of times they have a lot of defects. So you're making product over. And total cost, it's not just the labor costs that they have to think about. It's other things like shipping and like just logistics costs. And finally, the ability to get skilled labor in the United States. So these are all reasons why, particularly now with China, companies are reducing their dependence on China and moving things back into the States. That's a longer term trend that's probably going to continue.
I'm going to continue on the theme that Dr. Belcher mentioned about the long-term impact of the lockdowns. But it's interesting. We ordered our little giveaways in the School of Business, and the giveaways, like the water bottles and the little tchotchkes that we send to prospective students and alumni when we're at events, and we had an instance where we got 2 different batches from China, and the Pantone 201, which is a standard color for the university, was completely off, and we had to send them back. And And when we found out where they were manufactured, the supplier said, look, I can get it from you here in the United States, but it costs you a little bit more. But I figured at the net cost, since we had 2 failed shipping, we were able to have better quality control if it was made locally. And so, yeah, that's a big thing that Dr. Belcher mentioned that we're starting to find. So this is a little nerdy thing here. So what I did is I did quite a bit of research. This is from a couple months ago. And I pulled data from Bloomberg, the airline industry, a whole bunch of research reports that were out there. And ASQ stands for available seat kilometers. So, available seat miles is a synonym as well. And these are the amount of miles that are flown into or out of a city. And this is like number of passengers times number of flights times miles flown. So when it says 1 billion, don't get too excited about that. It's just, multiply it by a few times, you get up there. So this is before the lockdown. Indianapolis had a 54 billion ASQ number. That was the last full year reported. Immediately, that number dropped to 5.4 billion. So we lost 90% of our airline traffic. Now, what I did is I looked at all the airlines, their forecasts, because they have to put in route requests and gate requests and all this different kinds of data. And it looks like after the lockdowns are over, after everything's done, assuming we don't have a second lockdown, everything's back to normal, that we will be at about 50% of the ASQ coming into Indianapolis. The load factor, this is the percentage of seats on the plane. So for example, Delta is not selling the middle seat, so they can max out at 66%. The load factor prior to COVID, the lockdowns, was 83%. It dropped 27, it's now at 40, or the forecast is it'll be at 44. Airlines cannot make money at that rate. The most efficient airline in the market is Southwest, and they have a break-even load factor of 72%. American Airlines is the worst, they're at 79%. So at 44%, the airlines cannot survive. They will require either government subsidy or they'll go bankrupt. It is not mathematically possible for them to continue to exist. And if you look at the number of passengers coming into Indianapolis, it's going to be cut again in half. This is after everything's back to normal. So what does this mean to our economy? Well, look at the number of visitors. This is strictly tourism in Indianapolis. So conventions, the NCAA, high school football. People coming in from, outskirts to go downtown to see Cathedral beat Roncalli in a football game. So very, very important information there. We're going to see visitors drop from 29 and after 15. I think this is a very accurate forecast. So we're going to see, again, about half the visitors. Now here's the tax revenue. This is local tax revenue generated. So we're going to lose about $590 million in tax revenue. Again, this is after the recovery exists. What we will see on our annual local budget. Employment, we're going to be down 38,000 people, and those 38,000 people get paid something. And those wages are going to drop about $12 billion. Again, this is after the lockdowns are all recovered and everything's back to supposedly normal. Now, this is strictly tourism. Tourism is 2.5% of our GDP in the state, or GSP, gross state product. Now, luckily, other industries are not impacted as much. So Indiana is very fortunate because we have a strong manufacturing base. We have a strong logistics base. Those things are actually benefiting from an economic recovery because everything has to be transported. So we're in a very fortunate position in that respect. But there will be long-term impacts, and you will see a complete redesign of the city. You will be a complete redesign. Tourism, travel, we all go downtown to these nice restaurants. Well, they exist not because we go there. They exist because of tourism. If it weren't for the tourism, the restaurant wouldn't exist. We're just a beneficiary, a byproduct of their spending money in downtown Indianapolis. It goes for hotels, it goes for shopping, any retail. So this is going to be a significant change in the way that our economy functions that has been caused by these lockdowns. Now we got 2 slides here that we're going to wrap it up on. And the first thing is we're going to look at the Biden economic plan. And a lot of this comes from a report done by the Hoover Institute. You may be familiar with it at Stanford University. one of the preeminent economic programs in the world, and they did an analysis. The sad thing is the details, politicians don't like to provide many details because the more details you provide, the more people you offend. So their analysis was done, with what is available information. And what we see here is of course, he has a list of tax increases that he's been proposing. One of their data points was that if you live in New York City, the marginal tax rate with all the changes will go up to about 64% for an individual. Remember the rapper, what's it, 50 Cent said he's going to have to change his name to 20 Cent. That's where he got the data from. So this has been out there for some time, and Hoover and Stanford published this information. There's going to be a lot of fiscal stimulus. Forgive student loans up to $10,000 he's proposing be changed. A lot of increase in social program payments. Again, this is part of the fiscal stimulus package. There's going to be a big debate, of course, about how much of that should go to bail out cities and states, because you may be aware, for example, Illinois has, I believe it's about $150 billion deficit, unfunded obligation in their pension plans. And so one of the things that states are trying to do is to insert into the stimulus bills kind of a bailout for the historical unfunding of a lot of the programs, specifically retirement programs. Illinois and California are massive underfunded public pension programs. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's been a talk about expanding regulations on businesses, increasing loans to small businesses. The fear that I have about this is that a loan is a short-term solution, because if you just keep loading small businesses up with loans, that's not a very good financial model. And then, of course, what he's been talking about was a federal shutdown rather than the local shutdowns. We've already gone through one federal shutdown. And then he wants to create, he called it Biden Care, which was to create a public options, which would allow the government to compete with insurance companies for healthcare. And the risk that you run there is that it's really not competition, because the federal government has no requirement to make a profit or stay in business. They can lose money infinitely, and therefore that's not really competition. You're basically going to drive out every other business. So you've heard in the debates the argument between, does Biden Care lead to a one-payer system? And I assume President-elect Biden would say, no, it doesn't. But that ignores the reality of economics, which is if you have a competitor who can lose money infinitely, the competition doesn't stand a chance. Now, the thing about this, so this analysis was done before or with the assumption of control of both the Senate and the House. And as it looks today, it looks like there will not be control of the Senate by the Democrats. So it looks as if probably a President Biden will be dealing with a Republican Senate. So I think that a lot of these things that are in there are unlikely to occur in total. There will probably be compromise. And so when you look at the Hoover Institute's estimate of a $6,500 reduction per household in take-home pay, I doubt it's going to be that high. I'm pretty sure that there will be a compromise on a lot of the tax increases and the spending. And so I think a lot of these numbers you see on the right side of the screen will be impacted less so as compromise occurs in the economy. Larry, you want to add anything to this before we go on to the next one?
Well, one thing that I'll just throw in there is that, we had a period of loans to small businesses through the PPP loans, but those were forgivable under certain circumstances. So, if you met those circumstances, they would be wiped off the books. So that debt load potentially wasn't hanging out over a small business. So you think loans to small businesses sound good, but as Dr. Will says, if those things begin to pile up, you're pushing the inevitable off, and you're also increasing the debt load. If they're not forgiven, then at some point in time, those bills come due, and that may not really help all that much. And I would just echo what Dr. Will said about these estimates from Hoover. Once again, these were done a while ago, and they were based on the available data that they could pull from basically from publicly available data from the campaigns about what their plans would look like. So, they look pretty dramatic based on the assumptions that they made. But remember, economists love to make assumptions. And as Dr. Will said, they probably will be more compromised built into those numbers. So they probably won't look like that.
And we spared you all the another boring set of slides because we had both a Trump plan and the Biden plan ready to show you, and so we were just waiting for the tentative outcome. So we'll avoid that slide, but we will jump on here to the final one, and then we'll jump into Andy's more relaxed conversational mode, which means I'll take off my tie and get a cognac and sit back on my couch here. So lockdown 2. This makes us, and Dr. Belcher and I have talked about this. So this is, our professional opinion based on the information that we have available. And we are more nervous about a second lockdown than we were the first one. The first one, you can debate whether we should have had it or not. I personally did not object to it at the beginning because we had limited information. I think once we got into it a few weeks, we realized, okay, this was not necessary. Let's scale it back, but we didn't. And so, yes, I'll second guess the length of it and the loosening up of the lockdown, but I won't second guess the initial decision. But a second lockdown, we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot from Sweden. We learned a lot from South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. We've seen, that countries with massive hard lockdowns are having resurgence that were larger than the first. France, for example. And we're seeing that countries like Italy are not having as big as they first had, even though they've totally loosened up their economy in the summer. So what do we see here? Well, what we see if we have another one is there's going to be significant fiscal stimulus. That means the government will be spending massive amounts of money. The budget crises that we have in the municipal areas are going to get worse. Indianapolis, the state of Indiana, is not in terrible shape now, other than for the unemployment funds, which have run out. But the municipalities will probably be going under. You'll probably see a number of them file for bankruptcy. The small business closures Dr. Belcher mentioned earlier will be more pronounced because a lot of companies relied on their savings and their asset values to get them through. Bankruptcies have been primarily located in small companies. Yes, you hear about the J. Crews of the world, but those have been isolated. We'll probably see larger companies starting to go bankrupt where we haven't seen that so far. Not to mention him just because he's on the line here, but the mall developers of the world, they have been they've had a difficult time of it, but they've survived. I think if all of their tenants leave, then that's lights out. There's going to be another uptick in unemployment. Obviously, the real estate market has not collapsed yet, but that may be a result. And civil unrest, obviously, the more people are off. I mean, just look in history and around the world, when people don't have jobs, when the economy stinks, you just have a lot of civil unrest. Long term.
Will, could I jump in
ahead.
here?
Yeah, go ahead, Larry.
One of the things that I also want to emphasize about the real estate market, if you look at the vacancy rates now for properties in places like San Francisco and New York, they've spiked significantly. Another thing that we didn't really touch on is that a lot of companies have discovered that you don't necessarily have to have an office building to work. And in fact, once again, if you think about transmission, people packed in a place, in elevators, in offices, poor air quality, that kind of thing, it makes sense to maybe have people work remotely. And so a lot of places are vacating office space, particularly in larger urban areas, because of that. And so when you talk about real estate market collapsing, you might think of that, well, is that housing? But think about things in terms of office space and leased office space in particular in cities, and you might see that tick up.
So the last thing here is the long term. So I'll give you some quick examples. Nationalized industry, you say, what are you talking about? Well, the airline industry. The airline industry has a 43% debt to equity ratio. There's no way that they can continue to afford to pay that debt when they don't have seats being filled. Yet we can't have all our airlines go out of business. Boeing cannot go bankrupt. It is not an option for our nation, national security or otherwise. So you may see the government have to either step in like they did during 2009, maybe take an ownership share, take it over. Something's going to happen. Nationalize may be the wrong word, but you're going to see some significant government intervention. We mentioned travel and tourism earlier. That's going to be completely restructured. And of course, equity prices love stimulus, but that's a short term. It's a short term hit. It's kind of like taking the drug and the stock market shoots up because of government spending, but that eventually comes crashing down at some later point. And of course, the last thing is, people with money will be able to survive. They will move to Florida from high tax states. We've already seen a massive influx in Florida, and people that are on the low end of the economic spectrum, which we showed you from one of our first tables, they'll continue to suffer, and that gap is going to get even larger. Larry, you want to wrap up with any last words?
Yeah, I'll throw in one other thing. Dr. Will talked about companies being able to consume their assets to stay alive. Well, households can do the same thing. I mean, you can live off of your savings, you can consume assets. Maybe you have equity in your home that you can use for things. But those are, as Dr. Will said, those are short-term things. They're going to run out sooner or later. And when they run out, things are going to change. Right now, a lot of that V-shaped recovery, that spike up, that 33% growth in GDP in the third quarter was consumption driven. You take households out of the equation, you take household assets out of that equation, and then once again, that thing starts to look more like a W or something like that.
So Andy, I have a question for you. What do you call a person who keeps talking when nobody is listening anymore?
I don't know, Matt. What do you call a person who keeps talking when no one is listening anymore?
A university professor.
Very good. Well, with that, thank you, Dr. Will. Thank you, Dr. Belcher. Please feel free to ask a question in the chat, or you can turn your camera on and ask a question directly.
Well, Juan asked a question in the chat, so I'll read his question if he doesn't mind. He wanted our opinion on local and federal hourly minimum wage increases, and what is that going to mean? I'm giving a paraphrase version. Larry, you want to take that one?
Well, one of the proposals is that's been out there for a while is the kind of the $15 across the board minimum wage. I think what you're seeing in some places where minimum wages have gone up, on the West Coast, you're seeing more automation. You're saying you go to a McDonald's and there's a kiosk there. Well, what does that do? That takes people out of the equation. Now you spend money to put the kiosk in, but that reduces the number of laborers that you have to have. So we've seen that happening already. And I think if you go to some kind of a nationalized $15 minimum or whatever, restaurants are going to get hit hard. Other places that have minimum wage labor, their labor costs are going to go up. They're either going to reduce their employment or they're going to look to automate. I think that's what's out there.
And I'll tell you an interesting thing about that is if you go to Wendy's or McDonald's down the street here, and you'll see that their starting wage is $10 an hour. You can't find a place that's paying minimum wage except here in the university. We have our student workers. And so what happens is, let's say we've got our budget for student labor, and if we have to go up to $15 an hour, I will have half as many student workers in the School of Business. So you got to be careful because sometimes it's not not too many people are living on minimum wage. It's not a reality. Politicians talk about it, but it's just not the truth. So what you see is it's more of a training wage. It's more of an apprenticeship kind of wage that happens to people, students who are working part-time just to get some experience.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, I did have a question in my chat too. It said a lot of these numbers and projections talk about after the lockdowns and recovery. Obviously, no one knows when that will be, but do these projections assume it happens within a certain time frame?
The projections I put together does not assume a specific time. It was based on what the airline and transportation and tourism industry said, what they expect the other side of the lockdown to look like. So and there were various time frames. I would say most of them were looking at 12 to 18 months from the original start in March, but there's no specific time. It's really just post when things are back to normal and the government says, okay, you can all leave your homes.
I had a couple more here. What what industries do you see having permanent job loss? I think we touched on that a little bit in the presentation, but maybe recap that for us.
I would suspect, well, it's going to be tourism. It's going to be hotels. It's going to be entertainment. And I'll tell you, let me just say this, entertainment is the #1 industry that's going to get hammered the most. And people should not underestimate this, because entertainment drives economies. People go to the movie theater. From there, they go out to dinner, or they go to a club to go dancing, and they go out to dinner and they buy clothes and they transport themselves with a car, or hopefully an Uber at the end of the day when they had too much champagne. And so we see that a lot of these spin-off industries related to entertainment, we are an entertainment economy. It's not like the rest of the world. We are very fortunate that we have football games and concerts and dances and, every alumni event that Andy puts together, it's entertainment. And, they're great events and people should go to them. And that's really going to be hurt.
And, to piggyback on what Dr. Will's saying, you've seen a lot of major movie chains just shut down their locations. Once again, if you think about the virus and you think about, why we're locking down, which is to prevent transmission, a movie theater is an awful place from a transmission point of view to be. And so they're going out. The other thing that has been working on them for a while is streaming, to, kind of piggyback on what Dr. Will's saying. You can get entertainment at home now. You don't need to go anywhere. Now, if you want to go out to eat, to a restaurant, those kinds of places that have that density, the contact, the people in there, they're being hurt because they can't, if you have to operate a restaurant at 40% capacity, that's bad. Restaurants and other businesses that had an online presence already and could ramp that up, could do curbside delivery, could do all those things, they're faring better. But sit down places, that they're not faring as well. So, a place like Walmart that says, okay, we can ramp up grocery delivery, or Kroger, we've got the resources to do that. That's great. Your local Dairy Queen that says drive-through only. I mean, how many fast food places now say drive-through only? Can't go inside. You can call ahead, you can go drive-through, but you can't go sit. So that's fewer people, that's fewer dollars for them.
We got another one here. Said, and I like this question. This is a good one. What are the top 3 tools that the UIndy School of Business either has or needs to become a local, state, regional force in teaching its students and guiding us through the current recovery efforts and after the pandemic? A crisis is a terrible thing to waste.
Well,
okay, can I answer that one?
I'm gonna take a stab at it too, but you first.
Okay, from the dean's perspective, it's like the real estate question, right? What are the top 3 things for real estate? Location, location, location. What are the top things that we need? Money, money, money. That would be the dean's answer.
Okay.
Go ahead, Dr. Will.
Are you directing that at the fundraising guys on the conference call here? I'll tell you what we have, which is amazing, is we have an unparalleled Zoom lab. We have in place a finance lab, which has cameras in it, 2 monitors, a state-of-the-art sound equipment. We've had 2 events on campus where we brought in executives to speak to our students via the Zoom lab. So it's enough space. We could have a few of them in the lab, and we had about 200 people online. And it wasn't just like what we're doing here, which is a talking head. It was like a TV production where you have a studio and the cameras moving around and zoom in and zoom out. So we have, in my opinion, the best equipment out there. And now we only have 1 of those. So like Dr. Belcher said, give us money, we'll get more of them. The other thing which we need to do, and this is above my pay grade and above Dr. Belcher's pay grade, is I think the universities would benefit from having a more required in-person experience. I think that by being more locked down as we are, a significant majority of our students have no in-person classes. And I think that's to their disadvantage. I think we've learned that now if we had in-person instruction, I can tell you, I won't bore you with the examples, but we have lots of examples where students are afraid to leave their dorms. They're depressed because they're not going to class. Dr. Belcher tasked us with getting a mentorship program together to reach out to these students. It's going very successful. I think we need to change policy and have more in-person instruction.
And I'll put another thing in on top of that. One of the things that part of the question was, what can we do to better position ourselves in the community, and what are we doing for our students? One of the things that we thrive on is engagement. And part of what Dr. Will is getting at is this notion of engagement. And so one of the things that we talk to prospects about, and we try to communicate into the community, is we are an experientially based school. We desire a lot of student engagement, and we also desire a lot of experiential learning. And so we partner with local businesses and applied business classes. As Dr. Will said, we have speakers come in. We have try to have a lot of contact with the community, the business community, because we believe that those skills that we're teaching them, those applied skills, are really what they're going to need to go out and thrive on their own. And so that's how we position ourselves. That's kind of, we really built our program around that experience and about that engagement as really the centerpiece of what we do. So things like the lab and other things just assist us in that, but that's really what we're trying to do. And that's how we're trying to prepare our students to go out and to be able to walk into a job and be able to run with it as soon as they get in the door.
I would just add one thing to what Dr. Will said, in that we do have a 3-tiered class system, with tier 1 being virtual, tier 3 being all in person, tier 2 is kind of the bridge in between. That's a hybrid program, so some virtual, some in person. It's my understanding that almost every student has at least one in-person class, but I would certainly appreciate his comments that more in-person classes, the students would appreciate that and enjoy that. So at this point, I'd love to open it up to any other questions. Those all came through me to the chat, but is there anybody that has maybe one more question before we wrap up today that they've been wanting to ask?
Juan sent me a question through chat. Knowing the increase in market share in online sales in general and accelerated by COVID, should Amazon be broken up within the next 1 to 2 years? That sounds like an antitrust question. I'm not a lawyer. So I will punt. I will punt on that one. Larry, you want to make an opinion as to whether Amazon should be broken up?
I'm like you, I'm gonna punt on the antitrust. I mean, the whole tech antitrust thing is coming to I'll just say it's coming to a head. So, with Google, with Twitter, with Facebook, with Amazon, there'll be movement in that direction, I'm sure. But those kinds of issues are so complicated that, we don't need to go there.
I want to again thank Dr. Belcher, Dr. Will for spending time with us today. I want to thank all of you for joining us today and joining the call. I would be remiss if I didn't mention we have 2 more Hound Chats coming up. Next week, we have Dr. Lynn Shaw in our Phyllis Landlin social work program. She's going to do a laughing yoga exercise. Visit her on her social media. It's really quite engaging. So if you could join us for that next Thursday. And then our final Hound Chat of the year, the following Thursday, will be Scott Young. Scott is our Vice President for Intercollegiate Athletics, and he's going to give us a preview of the upcoming season, both winter and spring, for athletics, which of course are going to be dramatically different than what we typically have. So thank you all again. Thank you for being with us. Thank you, Dr. Will, Dr. Belcher. Everyone have a great day, and let's go Greyhounds.